The Builder is a game where players, 2, 3 or 4 players, compete against each other to gain the most amount of points, victory points, and the player which has the highest amount of victory points at the end of the game is the winner. The core of the game is based on structure cards, building cards, which are these, where the players, they try to build these buildings and add them to their own deck. These buildings, these cards do not only represent buildings, but they also produce resources, which could be wood, gold, wheat and stone. These are the 4 resources that we have in the game. So the players try to build these buildings, collect victory points, and they try to develop their civilization level. The end of the game is reached as soon as a player reaches level 5 of his civilization level and has built at least 7 buildings in the 2-player game, 6 buildings in the 3-player games, and 5 buildings in the 4-player game. Or the second condition to end the game is when a player reaches 41 points. For both conditions, as soon as conditions are reached, the game is stopped immediately. This is the playboard setup for a 2-player game, and let me give you an overview of the components. We have some player aid cards here, a random event card, market card, wonders, with the first wonder card which is already dealt. Then we have the structure cards with a deck, the player board, which is, I've made 2 versions actually. One is for the card game, and then we have a mounted version, but they are exactly the same. We have objectives. There is a point tracker, government, player board, which is in common to all players. There is also the card version of this. We don't care now for this, and also the card version for the point tracker, but for the sake of this video they are not required. Dice. Each player starts with 4, and the amount of dice can grow up to 7. Workers, inactive workers. Each player starts with 2, but they have 3 additional workers at disposal that they can gain during the game. Let's have a look at the player board. So we have a military level tracker, where players keep track of their military level, which can be increased to increase their die roll modifier, which is used during military actions. There is a technology level which allows to increase the amount of dice which are rolled at the beginning of the turn. We have a resource tracker and a civilization level tracker. Increasing the civilization level allows to gain more workers and to gain victory points. We have the cost showed here in resources. Then we have the inactive players and the tracker for the happiness of this civilization. The more military actions are taken, the worse becomes the happiness of this civilization, of the people belonging to this civilization. Let's have a look at building structures. We have each card represents a different type of building, which is showed at the bottom of the card, and also a different type of resource. When the player rolls a 6, he is allowed, or she, to place 1 worker on any card from the beginning. So these are the building's position of the card. And this worker, they will move along this building position, and when they reach the end of the track, the structure is built, and the player takes ownership of the card, gaining the victory point showed in the card. Now, how can this be built? This number represents not only the victory points, but also the 2 roll number, which is required for a worker to proceed with the building. Furthermore, when a building square is reached where a resource is shown on it, the player gains one of this type of resource, increasing the amount of resources in his tracker. As you can see on the buildings card, there are also other information printed on them. So basically we have 2 types of cards. Cards with a value of 4, 5 and 6, which brings a lot of victory points, but have no further action indicated on them. And cards with 1, 2 and 3 victory points, which allow the player to perform certain actions when the cards are built, so when the structures are built. So you may want during the game gain points, or you may want build something because you want to perform certain type of actions, which can vary and which I can try to explain you at fair. But how do you perform these actions? By rolling the number showed on the card. So if a player owns this card, for example, and he rolls 2-5 or 2-6, he may perform this action, which is a military action. But not only that, he may also use this combination of dice to produce this resource. So when this building is built, the player is not only gaining victory points, but he may perform an action or gain a resource with it. Interactions between the player. In this game we don't have it only with the military actions, but also during the building phase. So what happens? Let's assume we have a situation like this, and the yellow player rolls a 6. Rolls a 2, and he wants to produce this building. So now, what happens when 2 workers share the same square, building square? A confrontation happens. Both player rolls a d6, they add their military die roll modifier, and if the yellow has the higher number, then he may do a leapfrog movement and jump over the other worker. If it is equal or less of the value rolled by the green player, then he is not allowed to proceed. So this is the first type of interaction we have in the game. So that's why it is important to increase the military level. This is one of the reasons why it is important to increase the military level. Another type of confrontation is that if the yellow player, for example, rolls a 6, and he would like to start building the structure and the first position is occupied, he will do in the same way as for this other example. So both player rolls a die, they add their die roll modifiers, and the values are confronted, and if the yellow is allowed to start building this building only if he rolls a higher number than the green player. Otherwise the worker is simply placed back. Another type of interactions between the player is given by the military actions. So let's assume the yellow player has rolled 6 and 6. He may use now this card to start a military action against the green player. There are basically 2 types of military actions which can be performed. The first one is the destroy action. So the yellow player chooses a card which belongs to an opponent. For example, let's assume he chooses this card, and the yellow player rolls a d6, adds his military DRM, and if the number rolled is higher than the number showed on the card is destroyed and the victory points are adjusted accordingly. So the green player will lose 2 points. The card is placed back on the bottom of the deck. If the number rolled is lower or equal to the number showed on the card, to the victory points showed on the card, then simply nothing happens. The second type of action is a steal action. So the yellow player is not choosing a card anymore, but he's choosing instead a player. He says, I'm gonna steal a card from you. In this case, there is only the yellow player, the green player as opponent. So will be the green player. And in a steal actions, both player rolls a d6 and add their military strength. Now what happens? If the defender has a higher value than the attacker, nothing happens. The only thing which happens is that the happiness tracker is increased by 1 on the attacking player. If the number rolled is the same, then the attacking player must choose one of his cards, and that card is destroyed, and the victory points are adjusted accordingly. If the yellow player wins, then the losing defending player chooses one of his cards, which is not protected by a shield, and gives it to the attacker. And the victory points are adjusted accordingly. So now you see this is a shield. Every player starts the game with one shield, which allows them to protect one card. Now, the green player has lost one card in this case. And every time a player loses one card because of a steal action or because of a destroy action, gains a shield. So what happens during the military actions always is that the attacking player must move on the happiness tracker his token, regardless of the outcome of the military action, and the player who is attacked gains one shield in case he loses the card. So now let me explain you how this happiness tracker is working. So every time this player performs a military action, the token is moved to the right. Now, when the token reaches this position, then the player must take one of his dice, and this dice may not be used anymore during the action roll at the beginning of the turn. So the player has one die less at disposal. When the tracker reaches this position, a second die is placed in this position. If the player performs further military actions, the tracker simply remains in this position. So now the player may try to improve again the happiness of his civilization, of the people living in his civilization, by avoiding to roll for one turn. So if during one turn he decides to skip the roll action, the happiness is increased by 1 level. So we have also in the games wonders which are built almost in the same way as the building, the various buildings we have in the game. There are government types which may be chosen by the player. We have different type of governments with different type of actions which every government allows to perform. We have a random event which is performed at the beginning of every turn, all these type of things. And we have also a market which allows us to buy resources, but I would like to explain them and give you a full overview if it is possible at a fair. If it is not possible, then I need to put another video together where I show really an example of gameplay or the wall rules. Even if this is dice rolling game, the players are confronted with a bigger amount of decisions they have to take with the dice which are rolled, because with the same dice you may perform some actions, you may build, so gain resources. You may increase military technology level, or you want to proceed with building the buildings. What I've not mentioned was that any combination of two dice may be replaced by any die, and the player is allowed one reroll of unused die every turn. And also this game is played as I go, you go, so every player in the game at the beginning rolls their die, and then the first player in the turn starts performing one action, then the second player is performing an action, the third player is performing an action, and so on. So every turn or every round we have a different starting player. Random events and government incomes are produced before the dice are rolled.